Okay, so I want to record a quick video about what's the best way to build an email, because somehow this is still a topic in 2025. There are still people saying that plain text converts the best, and people saying that image only is bad and you shouldn't do it. And there are some dinosaurs from the email world that say that actually only and best and correct way to build an email is if you follow this like super convoluted 30-step process that they know and you don't, and unless you do it, you don't know what you're doing. So it's somehow still a topic that's being discussed, even though email marketing has been happening for like decades at this point. Hopefully this video is going to show you how it actually works. I'm going to show you examples from real brands that we work with so that you can see that ultimately it's pretty straightforward, and in many cases you shouldn't worry too much about it. So I'm going to do it in the following way. Number one, I'll show you examples from our companies. And number two, I'm going to show you examples from random companies that are out there in the wild that we are not actually working with, but just so that you see how other companies approach their email building. And hopefully by the end of this video, you won't need to worry or ask yourself ever again, what's the correct way to build an email? Am I building emails correctly? Okay, so this is an actual email that we've produced. And as you can see, it's image based. Like there's of course some dynamic elements at the very bottom, yeah, but for the most part it's all images, which means what? There is a Figma designer put this together, and then somebody sliced it into different sections and added them to Klaviyo, and then filled out the alt text and added a link, and then this is the email. And of course you can't do this with dynamic text, so this is another example. You can't do this for this text at the very bottom or the very top. This has to be a text block, but the rest you can easily do with images. And then even the product section here is an image on the left and an image on the right, and so on. And can you do this in a very custom way by coding the email? Of course you can, and there's people that can do this, but it's going to take a much longer time to do this. And an e-commerce brand, you should question yourself, is spending 4, 5, 6, 10 hours to craft a single email worth it when I can use image only builds that will only take 15 minutes or 20 minutes? And in my eyes, the answer is no, you should not. You should use what's easy and scalable for you as a company so that then you can do more of it. Why do you do designs like this? You do this so that you have complete control over how the email will look. And the fonts that you can customize with you and any other builder, you can potentially upload your own custom fonts and so on, but they won't necessarily render in the inbox. The image will look the way it's supposed to look, which is why this, from an aesthetic standpoint, is the preferable way to go about it. This is another example. Image. There's a long footer at the very bottom. Why am I showing you this? Because often the argument is that image only is bad for deliverability, but there's nuance to this, because to the extent that image only is bad for deliverability, it's only so because what inbox providers look at is the ratio between image and text. The keyword is ratio. They don't necessarily care if the text is at the top or at the bottom or anywhere in between, which means what? You can create a footer section, like in this case, that has a lot of text, and this will balance out the ratio between image and text. How important is this? We've tested this extensively, and what we see is that it only becomes a factor if something else is not optimal. In other words, if you're getting consent from users, if you're not messaging people you should not be messaging, in other words, and then if the content you send is reasonably engaging and interesting and is ultimately being sent to people that have raised their hand and showed some level of interest, whether they opened an email, they signed up for a coupon, they started the checkout, etc. If you do those two things, you don't really need to worry that much about how the email itself is built out. It only becomes a relevant factor if everything else is not going in the right direction. And there's another email. In this case, we do use text. Why do we use text? Because this is a newsletter and it does make sense to have a lot of text. So what's the rule of thumb? Go with the format that makes most sense in an individual case. If you are sending a message from a founder, if you're sending a newsletter, like in this case, use text blocks. It makes a lot of sense. Having said this, if what you want to do is create a very, almost like a landing page experience within the email, don't spend 20 hours trying to custom code the email. No, go with image slices instead. It's the easier and ultimately more efficient way to be doing things. It's also better for dark mode. It's better in a variety of ways. If you do worry about deliverability, what you can potentially do is A/B test the two versions, and then you'll see with your own eyes, does it actually play that big of a role? What you'll find is that it doesn't, unless something else is broken. But this is our experience. So what I've done is I've opened emails from other brands. I looked into my promotions folder and just to see how other brands do it. And what you'll see is that actually it's a mixed bag. In this case, this brand uses a little bit of text, then there's a button, then there's text again, and there's this image, etc. But arguably, this doesn't look as nice as it could, does it? Like the way the default tick emoji blends with the background and the standard Arial text, like in my eyes, it's not the best look, especially when I compare to the font down here below, which is actually a different font. So it makes it look, in my perspective, weird to the eyes. So I can't really say that this is bad, but I can't really say that I would want it for my brand either. Let's take a look at this. This brand, I think, does it in a better way. They have text blocks and they have image blocks, but they separate them in a clean way. So the design team created this nice graphic, but then this, which is just text, doesn't really clash with the design. There's space in between the elements, which is a way to go about it. If you'd like to not do image-only image, simply create space between the elements so that the text blocks can breathe. And then let's take a look at this. This is another example in this direction. They are using quite a few images, but the text is in a way harmonious with the design. It doesn't like blend in an unattractive way with it. And the reason why that's the case is because, again, there's space between the elements, and then they have consistent calls to actions. So the text section has the same call to action as these design sections do. And there's no extra call to action within the image that would have a different font or a different size or a different look. So ultimately it does look to the eyes harmonious. Let's take a look at this. This is just image, nothing else. I do not recommend this, by the way. I think, oh, hold on. We just saw the last part, so that's funny. But I think my feedback may still apply. So this is huge. I've never seen an email as long as this. And I want to use this as an opportunity to talk about plain text and why some people say, oh, plain text converts the best, etc. The reason why it converts the best is because people are reading it. And the reason why they read it is because when it's just plain text, you have no other choice. You can just read or not read. Whereas this email, it almost feels like a magazine, right? So like, okay, I'm seeing this first picture and then I scroll, but like I'm not reading all of that stuff because it's too much. It's not in my, I'm always expressing my own opinion, by the way, your mileage may vary, but in my eyes, it doesn't necessarily make the text easy to read in the way it's structured. So this is centered aligned, the text kind of, I don't want to say blends with the background, but it's not popping out, unlike this, which does. And then there's a lot of bolding, and then some images down here. So in a way, this requires a lot of cognitive effort for me to consume. And I actually don't want to do it in this case. Whereas a plain text, again, you will either read it or not read it. So your default mode is consumption. You are unlikely to scroll through it without paying attention to what it is. You will probably just read it or not read it. Gruns, image only from top to bottom. Unlike the previous email, I think in this case, the design does help increase the consumption of the content. The call to action pops out, there's graphs. Graphs are obvious, gruns better than placebo, big number with gruns, small number with something else. It's speaking to my lizard brain in a way. I don't need to put a lot of effort into it, right? And then there's big stars, social proof, big discount. Again, very clear and easy to understand. Curate is using a blend from what I can tell, more of an FAQ style of email, but this looks nice. Like again, to the eyes, it does look nice. So you can ultimately create nice looking emails without a heavy design. But in most cases, if you want like almost like this landing page look that we saw before, it's just way easier to do it with a designed email. This is image by our friends over at BetterMe. Beautiful aesthetics, clean design, zero text except what we have at the very bottom. And then this is from AllSense. I think they've messed up the slicing here. I see like this white line in between, which probably should not be there. So you can actually make mistakes when you're slicing things. Be careful when you do so. But yeah, it looks quite aesthetic. Arguably, this is of course subjective. They should have set a background color that wasn't white so that this looked more like one section, I guess. But I'm assuming this is a choice to separate the... I might be wrong actually, maybe it's better this way. But this is subjective. Now we get into design territory. From an email building standpoint, they use a little bit of text, but it's mostly image-based, even though they're a fashion brand. And then we have this, which is just text. And again, my reaction to this is, in this particular case, it looks spammy because like there's like codes and discounts and stuff like this. But it is unlikely that I would just scroll without reading the way I did on this email. I will either just not read this or I will actually read the entire thing, which is why plain text performs. And the principle when it comes to should I do plain text and how often should I do plain text is you should think about it as a pattern interrupt. So if you don't do it and you do it, it will likely work. If you only do plain text and then you do design, it will likely work. What matters is that you don't do the same thing every single time. The novelty factor and the pattern interrupt factor does play a big role. But ultimately, at this point, you saw with your very own eyes that there's different ways to build an email. But ultimately, just like from an efficiency standpoint, if you're looking at those brands that have like beautiful emails and you're like, oh, why don't our emails look like this? The reason why is because you're not using image slices. The design on Figma can be on Photoshop. Photoshop can be any other tool. It doesn't need to be Figma. But they design mostly on Figma and then you slice and you import the slices and that's it. And it's actually the easiest way to build emails. So if that's what matters to you, now you know how to do this. You shouldn't worry too much about deliverability if everything else you do is all right. And if not, probably you have bigger problems than email building itself.